Hi everyone. I want to provide you with a kind of toolkit for thinking about utilitarianism. Of course, utilitarianism is first an ethical theory. It has some theoretical interest in what it tells us about what matters, what is valuable, how valuable things are related to one another, and so on. It gives us interesting and sometimes interestingly different answers to these questions compared to other ethical theories. But a lot of the interest in any ethical theory is practical, when to figure out what it is right to do. Now, we all face ethical questions about what we should do, and we all encounter cases in which it seems to us that others are doing what is right or appropriate, or that they are not, that their behavior is wrong, maybe seriously wrong. We address these issues in terms of how we feel, what we think, sometimes in terms of a bit of reasoning or what seems intuitive, all of which is heavily influenced by background, upbringing, cultural and religious factors, and more. This isn't completely satisfactory. There are moral truisms which are easy to agree on: the value of honesty, the importance of keeping promises, not hurting people, and more. But as we might expect in something that's influenced so much by background and upbringing, there's also a lot of disagreement and a lot of difficulty in figuring out what to do when the cases aren't simple or obvious. For example, is it more important to keep a promise or to avoid hurting someone? What if you can't keep all the promises you made to different people? Keeping one may prevent you from keeping another. What to do if we can save one from being hurt only by hurting someone else? What I want to do is provide you with a toolkit for thinking issues through in utilitarian terms. It won't solve all the questions you might face. Sometimes that will be because we just don't know enough about what's true, what's possible, what's likely. When our knowledge runs out, or our evidence runs out, we may have to make a judgment call, bet on what seems most likely, and so on. Utilitarianism gives us a framework for thinking about these issues. We can sketch it quickly. Here are three core ideas of utilitarianism. First is an idea about happiness, about value, or about what matters. The utilitarian idea, the classical utilitarian idea, is that happiness is what matters. The more happiness, the better. That automatically tells us that reduced happiness and forms of unhappiness, such as pain, suffering, and misery, are bad. The less suffering, the better. Second is an idea about how to judge actions or policies or choices. We judge by their consequences. Roughly, an action is right when it has better consequences than the alternative. It's wrong when it has worse consequences. Likewise, for a rule or a law or a policy, everything gets judged by its consequences or results, good or bad, better or worse, right or wrong. Third, somehow we have to aggregate anything you do, any policy you adopt, any rule you follow, any law that's enacted is going to have a variety of consequences. More happiness for some, less for others. More happiness now, less later, and so on. Even when we agree that happiness is what is good, and that we're going to judge in terms of consequences, we have to put all the different consequences together somehow, and combine them to come up with a measure or estimate of what produces the most happiness overall. That is, counting all the results in terms of happiness and suffering. You can picture units of happiness on one side of a balance scale with equal-sized units of unhappiness on the other. Then the best option is the one that puts the biggest net balance on the happiness side of the scale. That's the basic picture: happiness plus consequences plus aggregation. If we have those ideas in hand, we can start thinking about how to apply them to particular cases, how to turn the ideas into a toolkit for analysis. There are a number of ways utilitarianism gets misunderstood. If you avoid them, you'll be well on your way to understanding and applying utilitarianism. Here's mistake number one. Utilitarianism means the greatest good for the greatest number. Therefore, we should do what's good for the most people, or for the majority. This isn't completely wrong, but it can be mistaking a slogan for the basic principle of utilitarianism. Think about it. What if the greatest good isn't the good of the greatest number? What if, say, lots of people need to be inconvenienced, traffic gets snarled, people are delayed on the highway, so that an ambulance can rush a single patient to the hospital? Saving the life of the person in the ambulance may be a greater good than not interfering with other drivers' plans, but it's not the good of the greatest number. When the case is clear, utilitarians will go for the greatest good every time over the greatest number. Mistake number 2. Utilitarianism is about consequences. So getting in trouble with the law is the utilitarian reason to avoid some actions. Well, utilitarianism does judge actions in terms of their consequences, but for utilitarianism's consequences means results, whatever actually happens because of an action. But sometimes people use consequences to mean a special kind of result, roughly a penalty, such as a fine for speeding, a jail term for stealing, and so on. That can't be all that a utilitarian means, though. A utilitarian wants to be able to give answers about whether it's right or wrong to impose the penalty, too. And it's not helpful to say that it's right to have a penalty for speeding because there will be a penalty if you don't. The reason for having and enforcing a rule against speeding, presumably, is because it reduces risks and saves lives. Alternatively, the reason driving too fast is bad is because it's risky and causes additional death and injury. Things like that have to be considered among consequences. In fact, things that will happen regardless of anyone arranging or setting up a penalty are the main kind of consequence utilitarians think about. Now, mistake number 3, thinking only about benefits. Sometimes it's easy to see a lot of benefits to a course of action and immediately conclude that utilitarians should support it. And sometimes supporting it is the right thing to do. But thinking only about benefits is not the right thing to do. You have to consider the costs or harms as well. Utilitarianism is about picking out the best option, the one with the best available mix of good and bad, the one with the maximum good or the minimum bad, if nothing better can be had. Now, a mirror image of this same mistake is thinking only about obvious bad consequences. A good utilitarian analysis will not stop there. It will consider whether there are good consequences that also need to be considered. Mistake number 4 is failure of imagination. We can consider both good and bad consequences, but still end up overlooking something important. One main reason this happens is that we may overlook what would happen if things were different, if what would happen isn't completely obvious or part of the reason already for the choice. Here are a couple of examples from the case of the company Uber. Sometimes people point to advantages of Uber's operation, such as providing cheap, reliable transportation. Sometimes they point to disadvantages, such as poor treatment of drivers. Utilitarians will consider both of these. But there may be other things that aren't so easy to see. For example, there's supposed to be good evidence that when Uber is operating in an area, there's a reduction in people driving intoxicated, which also means fewer alcohol-related damages, injuries, and deaths. Having an easy way to get home from bars or concerts makes a difference to how many people get on the road when they've had too much to drink. That's an advantage, which it's easy to overlook. Here's a possible disadvantage that might be easy to overlook. Uber and similar services seem well on the way to driving local taxi companies out of business. If there's a social role that taxis play that Uber can't play so well, for example, by having a steady, long-term workforce of drivers who build up relations within a community, losing that kind of connectedness in the community may be a non-obvious cost of the growth of Uber. And mistake number 5. Sometimes people say utilitarianism favors good consequences over what's morally right. Sometimes people are convinced that utilitarianism gives the wrong answer to a moral question. Sometimes the objection is that utilitarians are willing to do something wrong in order to produce better consequences. There may be something to this, but it's still a misleading way to put the point. It's misleading because the utilitarian thinks that considering consequences is how to figure out what's right or wrong. It's not that utilitarians know something is wrong, but think it's okay to do it anyhow when it'll have better consequences. If you disagree with the utilitarian conclusion, but agree that the utilitarian conclusion really will produce better results, considering everyone affected, you may be prepared for a fruitful discussion, but the disagreement is about what is really wrong, not about whether utilitarians think it's okay to do something wrong. If you take these 5 mistakes and avoid them, you'll be well on your way to effective and fruitful utilitarian analysis of the situations and moral problems you may come across. Thank you.